Oh wow. One quick thing. I took my glasses off. Oh, that's what I should do. All right.
Yeah.
Is that bad?
No,
Good.
Look again. Okay, because it might get glare. All right.
And welcome everyone to My TV. I'm Jessica Haro, and we're here with comic writer, editor, and teacher Jim Higgins.
Nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. You have worked in comics as an editor. Tell us about that and how you got started.
Well, I was working in a comic book store for years, right? And after that, I was a social worker, but I really wanted to get into comics. So I kind of was going to conventions in New York City and making friends with editors and anyone who I can, or I could. And eventually I made friends with a guy named Lou Stathis, who was an editor at DC in the Vertigo division. And he said at one point, look, I'm looking for an assistant, and he said, there's also 2 other job openings that you should apply for. So he didn't hire me, but another department hired me because of that. So I was in the Paradox Press division of DC Comics, and I started in '94.
So now I know Paradox Press is a unique division of DC. Their comics are different than others. Can
Right.
you explain how they are?
Yeah, we started in print in '95, and when we were around till a few years after, like 2002, 2003. But my boss Andy Helfer was really forward thinking, and so he wanted to put out books that would appeal, comics that would appeal to the general reader, not just superheroes, not just even anything else, but like something that the average person who was looking for a novel or an autobiography or a book on science would buy. So he came up with a line of books that we called the big books. And each book had a subject matter that was different than the previous one. Andy would call it the word. He said, we got to pick the word. So we did the big book of weirdos. We did the big book of urban legends. We did the big book of the unexplained. We did all 17 of those. Each book would be about whatever the subject matter was. So the big book of weirdos was a little tongue-in-cheek, but still very factual stuff about oddball people like Edgar Allan Poe and William Burroughs and Caligula and Rasputin and like that. Each book had about 60 different stories in it, all by different artists. So one of the appeals was you got tons of stories that were between 2 and 5 pages long, and you got all different artists. Again, Andy's idea was to make them in bite-sized little chunks, so that a person could read it and go, this is great, and put it down and pick it back up again, right? That it wasn't this big challenge of, oh my God, this is a new medium for me, this comics medium, I'm a little daunted by it. We also put out a line of mystery and crime graphic novels. And we did 6 of those. We were very lucky that 2 of them not only got made into films, but they got made into films by great directors, and they made great films. One of them was picked up by David Cronenberg and was called A History of Violence. And the other one that got made into a movie was called Road to Perdition. We found out that Tom Hanks had optioned the film, and we were optioned the book, and we were like, oh my God, this is unreal. And it got made into a film with Tom Hanks and Paul Newman, et cetera, et cetera. So we did that for years, and I was there, as an assistant beginning, and then eventually as an editor there.
So then what exactly does an editor do in comics?
An editor is really a project manager. So it's more than just being the same thing as an editor who's a book editor, right? Because we have story and art. So I would, for example, I would find a writer to write one of the big books, right? And the writer would give an outline, and then they would list a bunch of different people they would put in the story, that they would put in the book as stories. And then that would get an okay, and they would start writing scripts. So I would edit the scripts, and even in the script stage, you're looking to make sure that this is going to make visual sense on the page when the artist gets it. And then it goes to the artist. The artist will do very sketchy versions of each page. So why sketchy? Why so simple? Because if there's changes to be made, you want it to be done then, as opposed to when it's, the art's almost complete. So you send back feedback on on those loose, we call them layouts. And there may be small changes, there may be large changes. But again, all these changes are in service of readability and drama, to make it make sense, to make it be interesting, to make it be engaging. And then it goes more. You have to look at the finished art. Then you have to look at the lettering. If there's color, you have to check that the color makes sense. And on until you're basically at the last stage and it's going to go out the door. And you're the last person, maybe except the proofreader, who's got the last set of eyes on it. And then it goes to the printer. And that's the editor is there the whole journey.
So you started in editing, and now you teach at a lot of the art schools around LA.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what being an editor has taught you that you can bring
to being a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because you have your hands on so many different aspects of the production process, you really can bring to the teaching realm pretty much everything that they're going to need to know. So I've taught at different schools. I've also taught in different arts organizations, and so I have taught writers and artists. If you are taking my classes as an artist, you need to learn, first and foremost, is the visual storytelling aspect of comics. So I touched on that before, that as an editor, I'm looking for that even in the script stage. But that's something that you can't take a class on in very many places in the country, is learning visual storytelling for comics. It's similar to storyboarding for film, television, and animation, but it's still different because you're not just composing one image, you're composing an image that's going to be on a page, mapped out, and it's going to be, and it's going to be part of the whole page. So you design a page as well as just an image. And so I bring my knowledge as a story editor, right? I focus very much on helping them write a story that's good, that has good structure, that makes sense, that is interesting and engaging. And I'm also working with them to know how to put the art into the pages in a way that makes sense and in a way that makes a good story. So that's my editor hat comes with me pretty much the whole way through as a teacher. Because I know the whole process soup to nuts.
So what do you think artists and writers need to know to get started in the industry?
It really is different, for the two places, but the overlap is the visual storytelling that I mentioned just now. But writers need to understand what makes a good story, and they really need to understand that. One of the things I do is I tell them I'm a cliche killer. So you need to know what genre you're working in, and you need to know what's been done, and to not do something that's been done a million times. If you're doing something that's been done before, it better be a really interesting version of that, right? But they have to understand what makes a good story good. And the other part of it is that they really need to understand how to create characters that are interesting, that are keep our interest, that we feel are real people. So one of the pitfalls with people who write genre stories, right, who write horror stories, science fiction stories, fantasy stories, that sometimes they fall into being very attracted to coming up with a great plot, but their characters are not that interesting, or the characters are not that well developed. So I'm always on the lookout for that when I'm teaching to people writing genre stories, that they have to make sure their characters feel like real people to us. And so my time as a social worker informs that. I was a social worker for 5 years, I think I said. And that really informs my helping them to make good characters.
So what do you think as a teacher, how could art education right now be improved on?
It really depends on if you're going for comics. If you're going to comics and you're a fine arts student, you're going to learn a lot of stuff that's great to be a fine artist, but you won't be learning enough to really be a good comics artist. If you're in an illustration program, which is different than a fine arts program, you're much more likely to have the skills and the mindset to do comics. Right now, there are probably 10 schools where you can major in comics as an undergraduate. And then there's, 5, 6, 7 where you can get a master's degree in comics and graphic novel in doing that. So there's programs out there that they weren't around there like 20, 25 years ago. So if you're if you were someone who's in your senior year of high school and you want to do comics, you have the option to go to schools that actually can teach you that specifically. You're not trying to say, well, I got an illustration degree, but I really want to do comics. No, you can find schools that you can study comics.
Okay, so then, how has the industry changed since you worked in it?
It's changed a lot. One of the biggest changes has been the growth of manga. Believe it or not, Japanese comics first started getting translated in the 80s, and the American comics industry just didn't know how to really market them or do anything with them. They were putting them out like American comics, which is 22 pages at a month, and if you read a manga, that can often be something you read in 3 minutes. So eventually they realized, no, we have to put these out as the 250, 200-page books, the way that they are in Japan. And so that started in like the 90s. And by the early 2000s, the manga reading audience was huge. The biggest change that brought, though, with it was that girls and women were reading comics in numbers that they hadn't read in decades. And they were reading mostly manga. And there was an unfortunate bust in the manga market that one of the biggest publishers, Tokyo Pop, went out of business. And the market really dropped. Years went by, and now the manga is bigger even than it was 20 years ago. So if you go into a Barnes & Noble and you look at the graphic novel section, the manga section is just as big. So that's one of the biggest things. The other thing is what I had said that my boss, Andy, was hoping to happen, that was starting to happen in the 90s, was that the average person would start reading comics. And that's happening really, really in big numbers. The biggest change in that market is that about 10 years ago, there started being a real increase in the amount of comics that were being sold to young readers. So the 9 to 12-year-old range, which a lot of people don't realize is the Harry Potter book range, that audience started really reading comics a lot. And there were two comics creators who really were spearheading it, and just their sales went through the roof. Raina Telgemeier, her first graphic novel for the young readers was called Smile, which was an autobiography of when she was in 7th grade, landed on her face and knocked her 2 front teeth out. And then it was all about the horrors of 7th grade, which is horrible. And then there was another writer named Kazuo Kabuishi, who put out a comic called Amulet. Very, very different. It was a fantasy graphic novel for young readers. Those two creators have sold millions of copies of their graphic novels. And with that came more and more and more creators making graphic novels because there was a hunger for it. So that's one of the biggest changes in the market has been the young reader audience.
So with all these changes, what new challenges are there for new artists?
What new challenges are there? I mean, there is a lot of different subject matter that is already being done, but there are still genres that are not growing as quickly as others. So for some reason, even though fantasy is huge with the young readers and the YA, the young adult audience that read prose novels, there's not a lot of graphic novels that are fantasy in those age ranges. So I'm actually not sure why, but those editors are not accepting or looking for those books. And I think that there is a huge potential audience there. Same thing for science fiction. If you have a science fiction comic or a graphic novel that you want to sell, you really need to go to the comics-only publishers like Dark Horse Comics or Image Comics or Boom. One thing I should say is that Marvel and DC are the two biggest comic publishers that everybody knows, but they don't accept comics or submissions from outside of. They don't accept submissions from anybody. They will look for people they want, and they're big enough that they can afford to do that. Mm-hmm. So if you were starting out with your first graphic novel, you need to go either to a book publisher where you'd get an agent, or you need to go to a comics-only publisher like Dark Horse or Vault or Scout or Boom or some of these comics-only publishers.
Okay. Now, I know that you are starting something to help new artists.
That's true.
Tell us about that.
Starting on October 22nd, 2024, in a few weeks, I'm going to be opening for submissions for the Nemo Award. And the Nemo Award is named after Little Nemo, one of the first comic strips, started right around the turn of the 20th century. And the award is good. The award, it's a grant. It's called the Nemo Award, but it is actually a grant. It is $1,000 that will go to the best short story that is submitted to us during the open for submissions period. And that's going to be from October 22nd to December 10th. We are looking for new people. So if you have been published by a publisher, you're not eligible. If you've been on a website where you have been paid for publishing your comic, you would not be eligible. We're looking for new people. There's a fairly big list of requirements or rule outs that's going to be there for the story. So if you go to the website, my website, which is www.newsuit.net, you'll see Nemo Awards. You can click on that, or you can email me at nemoaward@gmail.com. A little bit more, the Nemo Award is to encourage people who are, really maybe at a place where they really don't see themselves as getting, into the comics world that easily. So we want to make it a little easier for them. That may be only enough for them to publish a small print mini comic, but that may be enough to get them going to be at a convention where they can sell their mini comics and maybe get noticed, or just be on their road to being, a real someone who is publishing comics a lot.
And I know that you teach online courses as well. Could you tell our audiences how they can find out more about those and sign up for them?
Yeah, I brand myself with no modesty at all as the Jim Higgins College of Comics. The college has one teacher, which is me. And if you go to my website and you click on Jim Higgins College of Comics, you'll see a list of classes that I will be doing. The next class that's starting, I'm going to do a class on writing horror for comics and film. So I do have a little crossover with the film audience. That's just a writing only class. But the most people who take it are going to write a graphic novel. Some of them are going to write and draw. Some of them are just going to write. And then I talked about how do you find an artist? What do you do when you find an artist, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how you can find my classes.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim, for meeting with us. And thank you, my TV viewers, for watching. Now stick around. We're going to have some more great interviews coming up.
Thanks. This has been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
It's not over yet.
Okay, bye. We're still saying bye. How long do we have to keep